It was an ordinary Tuesday afternoon when Officer Davis cruised down a quiet street in the heart of the city, his cruiser humming along with the rhythm of his thoughts. He had just finished his shift at the precinct and was looking forward to heading home when he noticed something that instantly caught his attention: a black sedan speeding just a little too fast for the residential area. It was a move that screamed for an officer to take action. His hand instinctively reached for the radio, prepared to call in a routine traffic stop. Little did he know, this stop would turn his world upside down in a way he couldn't have possibly predicted. The vehicle slowed as it pulled over to the curb, and Officer Davis' experienced eyes darted to the driver's side. A woman alone was behind the wheel. Her dark sunglasses obscured most of her face, but her posture was calm, collected, almost too relaxed for someone who had just been pulled over. As he stepped out of his cruiser and approached the car, Officer Davis couldn't help but notice the sleekness of the vehicle. Expensive, yet understated. There was a quiet confidence about this woman, one that put him on edge, but he dismissed it as nerves. "Good afternoon, ma'am," Officer Davis said, leaning down to get a better look inside the car. "I clocked you going a little over the speed limit. May I see your driver's license and registration, please?" The woman slowly lowered her sunglasses, revealing a pair of intense eyes that seemed to study him just as much as he was studying her. Her calmness didn't waver. "Sure, officer," she said with a voice that was smooth, almost soothing, but something about it was too perfect, too controlled. She handed over her documents without hesitation, her movements precise, her every action deliberate. As Officer Davis glanced at the ID, something unusual caught his eye. Her name, Maya Williams, seemed familiar, but he couldn't place why. He didn't have the time to dwell on it though. He ran the information through his system, waiting for the all-too-familiar beep confirming her identity. But what he wasn't expecting was the sudden silence that filled the air as the computer froze. His heart rate picked up. His eyes flicked back to the woman, who was still sitting perfectly still, a slight, knowing smile tugging at the corner of her lips. He felt a shift in the atmosphere, something heavy, something different. He checked the screen again. This time, it wasn't just a name. The system showed a full report. "Special Agent Maya Williams," it read. "Federal Bureau of Investigation." The words didn't quite register at first. Officer Davis blinked, then reread the screen, unsure if he was seeing things. The woman's calm demeanor remained, but the air around them thickened. It wasn't every day an officer ran into an FBI agent, especially one who had been moving through the city without raising any suspicion. Was it a coincidence? Or had he just unknowingly pulled over someone much more powerful than he could ever imagine? The silence between them stretched, thick with tension. Officer Davis cleared his throat, his instincts screaming at him to tread carefully. "Agent Williams?" He stammered, trying to process the information that was slowly sinking in. "Yes, Officer Davis," Maya replied, her voice laced with a mix of patience and something else, a quiet authority that sent a chill down his spine. "I'm afraid there's been a misunderstanding." Just then, the world around them seemed to pause. The quiet hum of the street, the distant sound of traffic. It all faded into the background as Officer Davis stared at the woman, now fully aware that this wasn't going to be your typical traffic stop. He could feel his pulse racing, his mind spinning with questions. Before he could gather his thoughts, a loud sound echoed from behind the sedan, a sudden, unmistakable screech of tires. Officer Davis instinctively turned, his hand dropping to his holster. But as he looked over his shoulder, he saw something that made his heart drop. Another car, black and sleek, was speeding down the street toward them with reckless speed. And it wasn't stopping. Maya's calm smile never faltered, but her eyes, those piercing eyes, flashed with something else now. "I think you should step away from the vehicle, officer," she said, her tone shifting from polite to serious. "Now." Before he could react, the other car screeched to a halt, and 3 men dressed in dark suits stepped out. Their movements were synchronized, professional, but there was a danger in the way they carried themselves, something that made the hairs on the back of Officer Davis' neck stand on end. One of the men, tall, with cold, calculating eyes, locked eyes with Maya, and in that instant, it was clear this was no ordinary traffic stop. The tension in the air thickened, and Officer Davis' mind raced as he tried to understand what was happening. Who were these people, and why was Maya Williams, an FBI agent, involved with them? The questions seemed endless, but the answers, if they existed, were just out of reach. Maya stood slowly, the calm authority still present in her every movement, as if she was fully aware of the storm that was about to unfold. "Officer," she said softly, "you've just been pulled into something much bigger than a simple traffic stop. You need to listen to me carefully because what happens next could change everything." Before Officer Davis could process her words, one of the men in suits stepped forward, his hand hovering near the gun at his side. The message was clear. They were in control now. And just like that, the world as Officer Davis knew it began to unravel. What followed, what was about to happen, was beyond anything he could have imagined. The fate of this day of his life would be decided in the next few moments, and there was no going back. The only question that remained was, who could he trust now? Officer Davis' mind raced as the three men in suits closed in around him, their eyes cold, focused. He could feel the pressure building, the weight of something he couldn't quite grasp settling over him. The street seemed quieter now, more distant, like the world had moved just out of reach. The man who had stepped forward, the one with the calculating eyes, gave a quick nod to Maya. It was a signal, one that set off a cascade of thoughts in Officer Davis' mind. He knew something wasn't right. But what? Maya had remained calm throughout the whole exchange, but now she looked directly at Officer Davis, her expression serious, her voice lowered to a near whisper. "You need to stay calm, officer. Whatever you think is happening here, it's bigger than you. Trust me." Her gaze flicked over to the men in suits, and for the first time there was a flicker of something in her eyes. Fear. No, it was more like warning. She was trying to tell him something without saying the words aloud. The man who had stepped forward, his jaw sharp and unyielding, turned his attention back to Davis. "You're in a dangerous position, officer. You have no idea who you've just stopped. I'd suggest you stay quiet and let us handle this." His voice was smooth, yet laced with an undeniable threat, one that cut through the tension in the air like a blade. Davis took a step back, his instincts screaming at him to reach for his weapon, to take control of the situation. But his eyes flicked to Maya. She was FBI. She had to be. But then why were these men here? And why was she so calm about this turn of events? Was she in on something? Had she been compromised? Davis opened his mouth to ask, but before he could speak, Maya held up her hand, a silent plea for him to listen. "Please," she said, almost urgently now, "just stay still. Don't make this worse than it needs to be." Her words hit him harder than he expected. There was something about her, something he hadn't noticed until now. The controlled way she held herself, the silent power radiating from her. She wasn't just a cop, she wasn't even just an agent. There was something more to her, something buried deep under the surface, but whatever it wasn't something he could quite piece together in the moment. The man in the suit took another step forward, this time reaching into his jacket and pulling out an envelope. His eyes never left Officer Davis as he held it out for Maya, who took it without a word. She glanced at the contents quickly, then handed it back. "Officer Davis," Maya began again, her tone softer, but carrying a weight that made his stomach churn. "You've been caught in the middle of something that's far bigger than any of us. There are people in this city who have been watching you, tracking you. Not just you, everyone. The reason you were pulled into this mess is that you become a part of something much larger. And the people who are involved, they're not who you think they are." The words hung in the air, hanging like a dark cloud that refused to break. The fear that had been growing in his chest now spread, creeping up his spine. Who were these people? What was she talking about? How could he be a part of something so dangerous without even knowing it? Maya's gaze softened, just a fraction, and for the briefest moment, she looked almost apologetic. "I never wanted you involved in this, but now that you are, there's no turning back. I can't explain everything right now, but I need you to trust me. I know this isn't easy to understand, but it's the truth." Before Officer Davis could respond, the man in the suit with the cold eyes spoke again, his voice like gravel, unyielding. "We don't have time for this. We were clear, Agent Williams. We handle this from here." Maya's expression hardened instantly. She glanced at the man sharply. "You think you can just step in and take over? No, this is still my operation." "Not anymore." The man shot back, his voice laced with a quiet menace. "The situation has changed, Agent. You don't control this anymore. You never did." There was a split second where the air seemed to snap, crackling with an energy so palpable it was as if the world itself was holding its breath. Officer Davis could see the tension building between them. These weren't just ordinary people. Whatever they were involved in, it was far beyond the scope of what he'd ever imagined. The FBI was supposed to protect citizens, wasn't it? Yet here she was, involved with these men. Men who clearly had power, resources, and connections that made his own job feel like a game of checkers against their game of chess. Maya's jaw clenched. "You don't get to decide this," she said, her voice low but fierce. "You don't control me." The man didn't flinch. Instead, he stepped back, signaling to the others, who began to move with quiet precision. "You'll regret this decision, Agent. You've already gone too far." Davis watched as Maya's eyes narrowed, her gaze never leaving the man. Something shifted in her posture. She was ready. Whatever was about to happen, she wasn't backing down. And then, just as quickly as it had started, the moment passed. The men in suits turned and started to walk away, their footsteps purposeful. But the weight of their words still hung in the air, thickening with each step they took. Officer Davis was still frozen, his hand lingering near his gun, but unsure whether to draw it or keep it holstered. He watched as Maya placed the envelope in her jacket pocket, her eyes never leaving the retreating figures. The tension didn't dissipate. It festered, growing like a wound that hadn't been given the chance to heal. The unsettling feeling of being out of his depth gnawed at him. Finally, Maya turned to him, her eyes softening just a little. "You're not safe here anymore. They'll be watching you, just like they've been watching me. Whatever you thought you knew, it's all wrong." She stepped closer to him, her voice dropping to a near whisper. "I need your help, and I need you to stay quiet. I'll explain everything when I can, but right now, we both need to stay alive." Davis felt his heart pounding, his mind a blur of questions. But as he looked into her eyes, the weight of her words sank in. She wasn't just some agent. She wasn't just a woman in a traffic stop gone wrong. She was a part of something far bigger than he could understand, and now he was trapped in it, whether he liked it or not. And before he could say anything, the world shifted again. The unmistakable sound of a siren cut through the air not far off. Maya's eyes widened for just a split second, her face hardening as she looked in the direction of the sound. "Get in the car," she said urgently, her voice sharp and commanding. "Now." The sirens grew louder, the sound closing in. Davis didn't hesitate. He scrambled into his cruiser, Maya right behind him. As they sped off into the unknown, one thing became crystal clear. Their lives were about to change forever, and there was no going back now. The engine of the cruiser roared to life as Officer Davis pressed down on the accelerator, pushing the car down the empty streets with urgency. Maya, sitting beside him, didn't say a word at first, her eyes scanning the rearview mirror, every inch of her body tense, alert. The sound of the approaching sirens grew louder, but it wasn't the police who were after them. That much Davis was sure of. He shot a glance at her. Who were they? Those men. What was that all about? Maya didn't look at him. Instead, her gaze stayed fixed on the road ahead, her hands tight on her lap. It wasn't until they reached an intersection, and she turned to him sharply, that she spoke. "You don't get it, do you?" Her voice was low, almost harsh, like she was trying to keep the panic from breaking through. That wasn't just a traffic stop. Those men, they were connected to something bigger, something I've been investigating for months. And now so are you. Davis blinked, trying to process. "I don't understand. I'm just a cop, Maya. What do I have to do with this?" She was silent for a long moment, as though weighing her words carefully. The streetlights cast long shadows across her face, giving her an almost ghostly appearance. "You were at the wrong place at the wrong time. You got too close to something you weren't supposed to see." Her voice dropped to a whisper, but there was an unmistakable edge to it. "Those men, they're not just any operatives. They work for a covert organization, one that has infiltrated all levels of power. Local law enforcement, government agencies, even the military. They have people everywhere." Davis could feel his pulse quicken. He'd always thought the world was black and white, good guys, bad guys, but now he was realizing how naive he'd been. He was in over his head, and everything he thought he knew about his job, his life, was starting to crumble. "But why me?" he asked again, this time more firmly, trying to understand what part he had played in all of this. "Why target me?" "Because you were too close," she repeated, her eyes flicking nervously to the rearview mirror. "I wasn't supposed to be seen either, but someone tipped them off. They're watching everyone, even me. They know things they shouldn't know. They've infiltrated law enforcement, Davis. They're everywhere." A sinking feeling settled in his stomach. This wasn't just a random encounter. This was orchestrated. And now he was in the middle of something dangerous, something he couldn't control. As they sped through the streets, Maya's hand shot out, pointing down an alleyway ahead. "Turn here," she said, her voice sharp with urgency. "Now." Davis didn't hesitate, his hands instinctively guiding the wheel. He barely noticed the direction they were heading, only focused on getting them out of sight. He knew the sirens were getting closer. Whatever was chasing them wouldn't stop until they were found. As the car swerved into the alley, Davis could see the streetlights flickering on and off in the distance. His mind raced, trying to connect the dots. So, what happens now? What's the plan? Maya didn't respond immediately. She was studying something on her phone, tapping at the screen with rapid precision. Her fingers moved so quickly, it was like she was calculating something, putting together pieces of a puzzle that only she could see. "We have to get to a safe house," she said, finally meeting his eyes. "A place where we can regroup. I got contact. Someone on the inside. They'll help us, but we need to move fast." A sudden explosion of noise broke through the tension, the sound of tires screeching to a halt. They weren't alone. The men in suits had found them. Dacre's heart skipped a beat as he slammed on the brakes, the cruiser screeching to a stop in the middle of the alley. Maya's voice was urgent. "Get out of the car. Now." He didn't need to be told twice. The sound of heavy footsteps echoed from the other end of the alley. Dacre grabbed his radio, but before he could get a word out, Maya knocked his hand away. "Don't," she warned, her voice low and firm. "They'll be listening. Don't make it worse." They both slid out of the car, slipping into the shadows. The alley was narrow, and the shadows seemed to stretch forever as they darted behind a dumpster, crouching low. Dacre's heart pounded in his chest, each beat louder than the last. Maya leaned in close, her breath coming in short bursts. "Stay low. Stay quiet. Do not make a sound." Davis swallowed hard, trying to steady his nerves. The sound of footsteps grew louder, closer. The men were coming. His hand instinctively went to his holster, but he remembered Maya's words. His gun wouldn't help him here. They were up against something far bigger than they were. The figures emerged from the end of the alley, moving with precision, their eyes scanning the shadows for any sign of movement. One of them, tall with dark, almost predatory eyes, stopped for a moment, scanning the ground. It was like he could sense them there, waiting, hiding. Dacre's breath caught in his throat, but Maya was already ahead of him. She pulled him closer, guiding him to the side of a building. She moved with the speed of someone who had been trained for moments like this, someone who knew exactly how to survive. The danger wasn't just physical, it was psychological, and it was clear that Maya was playing a dangerous game, one that Davis had no idea how to navigate. "We need to move," she whispered urgently, her voice barely audible. "They're coming for us, and we can't let them catch us here. There's a back door up ahead. Follow me." Davis nodded, his mind still reeling from everything that had happened. He didn't know if he could trust her completely. There were too many unknowns, too many questions that had yet to be answered. But right now, she was his only ally, and he didn't have a choice. They moved quickly, creeping along the edge of the building. The sirens were now distant, replaced by the sound of the men searching, calling out to each other, their voices echoing down the alley. It felt like the walls were closing in, and Davis had no idea how this would end. As they reached the back door, Maya stopped, pressing her ear against it. "We don't have much time," she muttered. "When I open this, we run. You stick with me, no matter what." Davis' hand clenched into a fist. His mind was filled with too many questions. About the men in suits, about Maya's involvement in all this, and about the shadowy organization that seemed to be pulling the strings. But all of that would have to wait. Right now, survival was the only thing that mattered. Maya nodded to herself and, with a swift motion, opened the door. "Go," she hissed. They rushed through the door into the darkness beyond. The chase had only just begun. The door slammed shut behind them with a muffled thud, and the darkness of the back room swallowed them whole. Davis could barely see anything. The only sounds were the rapid breaths between them and the distant noise of pursuit echoing from the alley. They were running out of time, and his pulse pounded in his ears. Maya didn't hesitate. She moved quickly, already assessing the room, her eyes darting across the space as if she was searching for an escape route. "Stay close," she whispered, her voice cold with urgency. "We need to get out of here now." Davis followed her without a word, his mind racing. How had things escalated so quickly? One minute he was doing his job, pulling over a routine vehicle, and the next he was caught in a web of conspiracy, pursued by people who had the resources to find anyone, anywhere. His life felt like it had been ripped from its tracks, and he had no idea where it was headed. They moved silently through the room. Maya stepped sure, while Davis stumbled slightly, trying to keep up. He could feel the sweat on the back of his neck, the weight of fear pressing down on him. The men in suits were close, and they weren't going to let up. They were hunting him now, just as much as they were hunting her. Maya stopped abruptly in front of a narrow door at the back of the room. She paused, listening intently. The seconds seemed to stretch into minutes, each passing moment feeling like a countdown to something unavoidable. "We don't have much time," Maya muttered, her voice tight with tension. "They'll be here any second. When I open this, we run. No hesitation." Davis nodded, trying to steady his breathing. His hands were shaking now, not just from fear, but from the weight of the unknown. What kind of operation had Maya really been involved in? What had he gotten himself into? She opened the door carefully, peeking out into the corridor before gesturing for him to follow. As they slipped into the hall, the silence was almost unbearable, broken only by the occasional creak of the floorboards beneath their feet. Maya led the way, her steps calculated, as though she knew exactly where she was going. But Davis wasn't so sure. How could she be so calm? The situation was spiraling out of control, and the more he thought about it, the more he realized that nothing was what it seemed. Maya wasn't just another agent. She was someone deep inside a world of secrets and dangers he couldn't even begin to understand. They turned a corner, and suddenly the flicker of movement caught Davis' eye. His heart skipped. One of the men in suits appeared at the end of the hallway. He was too far away for a direct confrontation, but there was no way they could slip by him without being noticed. Maya saw the man too, her eyes narrowing, her body stiffening with the same recognition. Without a word, she grabbed Davis' arm, pulling him quickly into a side room. They crouched low, holding their breath as the footsteps neared. Davis' mind raced, but there was no time to think. His survival instincts kicked in, and he squeezed his eyes shut, trying to block out everything except the sound of their pursuer. The footsteps stopped just outside the door, and Davis' heart seemed to stop along with them. Time seemed to stretch infinitely, each second dragging on. The man was close, so close, and he had to have heard them by now. Davis could almost hear the man's pulse in his ears. "Move," Maya's whisper sliced through the silence like a knife. She was already standing, her hand gripping the door handle. Before Davis could respond, she yanked the door open just a fraction, peering out into the hallway again. Her eyes scanned quickly, calculating the risks, and then she gestured for him to follow. They darted across the hallway, the tension in the air so thick it felt like it could suffocate him. He could hear the man's voice now, a low murmur just outside the room. The sound was unsettling. It felt like the calm before a storm, like something terrible was about to unfold. And then, just as they rounded the corner, a new sound pierced the air, a loud crash, followed by the unmistakable sound of footsteps. More men. More of them. Davis' heart leaped in his chest, panic surging through his veins. "We're not alone," Maya hissed, her voice suddenly strained. "This is bad. We need to get out of here. Now." But where? Davis looked around frantically. There were no obvious exits. The hallway stretched on, endless, like a maze designed to trap them. The walls seemed to close in, and the oppressive silence only made it worse. Then, a door at the far end of the hallway swung open. A woman in a dark uniform stepped out, her eyes locking with Maya's. For a brief moment, neither of them moved, and Davis couldn't help but wonder who this new figure was. Another ally? Another enemy? "Go," the woman said, her voice low but urgent. "I got your back." Maya didn't hesitate. Without a word, she grabbed Davis' arm again, pulling him toward the woman. The two of them exchanged a look, one filled with unspoken understanding, and then Maya was leading him down the hall toward the open door. The woman shut the door behind them as they slipped inside. The room was small, sparse, just a few desks, a chair, and a row of cabinets. It felt like they had entered a forgotten part of the building, one that had been left untouched for years. But Davis didn't feel safe. Not yet. They were still being hunted. And this woman, who was she? And why was she helping them? "Who are you?" Davis finally managed to ask, his voice tight with suspicion. "What's going on?" The woman didn't answer immediately. She moved quickly across the room, her steps light but purposeful. Finally she turned, her face etched with a mixture of concern and determination. "I'm part of the team you've been unknowingly working for," she said, her voice low. "We've been keeping an eye on you, officer. You've gotten yourself caught in something much bigger than you can imagine. Something dangerous." Maya gave her a sharp look. "How much do you know?" The woman hesitated. "Enough to know that they've been tracking both of you. And if you get leave now, it's only a matter of time before they find you again. We need to move, and we need to move fast." The tension in the room was suffocating. The clock was ticking, and Davis could feel the weight of it pressing on his chest. The answers he so desperately needed were just out of reach, and the more he learned, the more questions seemed to pile up. And just as they started to move, the sound of footsteps echoed down the hall once again. This time there was no mistaking it. The hunt was on, and was closing in fast. The footsteps grew louder, closer, and the heavy thud of boots echoed down the narrow hallway, signaling that the men were right outside. Maya and the woman exchanged a brief look, an unspoken understanding passing between them. There was no more time to waste. "Go," Maya muttered urgently, pushing Davis toward the far corner of the room, where a door led to another hallway. "Move fast and don't look back." Davis barely had time to react before the woman in the dark uniform was beside him, guiding him toward the exit. He gasped behind him, watching Maya approach the door, her eyes fixed on the sounds of pursuit. It was clear she wasn't planning to run. Not yet. "You're not leaving without me," Maya said firmly, as if she knew what Davis was about to say. Her expression was a mask of determination, but Davis could see the underlying tension in her posture, the quickness of her breath. She was running out of time. Before he could argue, the woman spoke up. "We don't have the luxury of waiting. Maya, they're coming, and we have one chance to get out of here. They won't hesitate this time." Maya hesitated for a moment, but then nodded. "Fine," she said with a sharp breath, "but we need to move fast." They ran down the hallway, the woman leading the way with a steady pace. The air felt thick, oppressive, as though every step brought them closer to something they weren't ready for. The light overhead flickered, casting shadows that seemed to move on their own, heightening the tension with each passing second. Just as they reached the end of the hallway, Davis' heart skipped a beat. Another figure appeared, stepping out from behind a corner. This time, it wasn't one of the men in suits. It was a man he recognized, a face he never thought he'd see again. "Travis," Davis whispered, his voice caught in his throat. The man who had once been Davis' partner, someone he trusted implicitly, stood before them, his eyes cold and calculating. But the person in front of him now wasn't the Travis he had once known. This man looked different, sharper, more dangerous. His eyes flicked over Maya and the woman, then landed squarely on Davis. "What's going on, Davis?" Travis asked, his voice smooth, almost too calm. "You don't want to be in the middle of this. I can make this easy for you." Davis stood frozen, confusion swirling in his chest. "What do you mean? What's happening? What is all this?" Travis didn't answer. Instead, his gaze shifted to the woman, his face hardening. "You're in deeper than you know, all of you. But you don't have to keep running. We can end this right now." The woman in the dark uniform stiffened, her hand instinctively going to her gun. "Stay back, Travis," she warned, her voice low. "You don't know what you're dealing with." Davis couldn't take it anymore. "Travis, what are you talking about? You're with them, aren't you? You're one of them." Travis didn't flinch, didn't even hesitate. He simply nodded slowly. "Yeah, I'm with them. And so are you, Davis. It's time you figured that out." The words hit Davis like a punch to the gut. His world tilted, and the ground seemed to shift beneath his feet. The people he thought he could trust, the woman who had just helped them, Maya, Travis, none of it made sense anymore. He had been played, manipulated, dragged into something far bigger than he could have imagined. "I tried to protect you, Davis," Travis continued, his voice softening, though his eyes remained cold. "But this isn't your fight anymore. You've crossed a line you can't uncross. All of you have." Maya took a step forward, her eyes blazing with fury. "You traitor," she spat, her voice thick with disdain. "You sold out." Travis' lips curled into a thin smile. "It's not about science anymore, Maya. It never was. It's about power, who has it, and who's willing to do what it takes to keep it." Davis shook his head, trying to process what was happening. "But I could understand. Why didn't you warn me? Why didn't you tell me the truth?" Travis's smile faltered slightly, but his resolve remained unshaken. "Because it wasn't your choice. You were never meant to know. None of you were supposed to be involved. But now that you are, the only thing left to do is play your part." Before Davis could respond, the sound of heavy footsteps echoed from the far end of the hallway. The men in suits had found them. They were close, too close. "Move," the woman in the dark uniform hissed, her eyes flashing with urgency. "We don't have much time." But Travis didn't move. Instead, he stepped toward them, blocking their path. "You think you can just run?" he asked, his voice low and dangerous. "No one leaves this game once they're in it." The tension in the hallway became suffocating, the air thick with uncertainty. Maya's hand hovered near her weapon, her body tense with readiness. Davis' mind was racing, his heart hammering in his chest. He had no idea who to trust anymore. Travis, the man he had worked alongside for years, was part of the enemy. The woman who had been helping them might not even be who she said she was. And then, just as quickly as it had started, the sound of the approaching footsteps grew louder. The men were almost there, and Davis knew they had no time left. "Go," the woman shouted, grabbing Davis' arm and yanking him forward. "Now, Davis, run." But as they moved, Davis caught one last glimpse of Travis' eyes. A flicker of something, guilt, maybe, or regret. passed between them, but before he could process it, he was being dragged down the hallway. The door at the end of the corridor slammed open just as the first of the men in suits rounded the corner. The woman fired off a single shot, the sound deafening in the narrow hallway, and the figure in the suit dropped to the ground. But it wasn't enough. More figures emerged from the shadows, and the chase was on again. The stakes had never been higher, and now, as they sprinted through the building, Davis realized that nothing, absolutely nothing, was what it seemed. The corridor stretched out before them like a dark, endless tunnel, every step echoing in the silent air. Davis' heart hammered in his chest, his breath coming in short, sharp bursts as they ran. The woman led the way, her pace relentless, eyes scanning every corner, every doorway, every shadow. Maya was just behind him, keeping her focus sharp, but Davis couldn't shake the feeling that they were running straight into something much worse than they could handle. They reached a door at the far end of the hall, and the woman in the dark uniform didn't hesitate. She slammed her shoulder into it, bursting it open with a crash that reverberated through the building. The room they entered was dim, filled with old furniture and abandoned equipment, but it was quiet, almost too quiet. "We need to move fast," the woman said, her voice grim. "There's a way out through the back." Before Davis could ask another question, Maya grabbed his arm. "Listen to her, Davis. This is the only way out. If we don't make it through, it's over." Davis nodded, trying to push down the fear clawing at his throat. The world had turned upside down in the last few hours, and he still didn't fully understand why any of this was happening. Travis had betrayed him. The woman, who had called herself his ally, had been playing a dangerous game of her own. And now they were all being hunted. They moved quickly through the room, the woman leading them toward a small door at the back, one that Davis hadn't even noticed in the chaos. But just as they reached it, the sound of more footsteps, fast and heavy, filled the air. The men in suits had caught up with them, and there was no escape. "No time," the woman said, her eyes narrowing. "Get through now." But just as she reached for the door, the sound of a gunshot rang out, a sharp, deafening crack. The woman staggered, her body jerking forward from the impact, and she crumpled to the floor with a heavy thud. Davis froze, his heart nearly stopping in his chest. Maya rushed forward, kneeling beside her. "No," she shouted, but the woman's eyes were already losing focus. Blood pooled beneath her, dark and spreading across the floor. "We have to go," Maya urged, grabbing Davis by the arm again. But Davis couldn't move. His mind was reeling, unable to process the sudden loss. Who had shot her? How had they found them so quickly? He looked down at the woman's face, her features still marked by the same determination she had shown earlier. She had helped them. She had saved them. And now she was gone. Before Davis could react further, a voice called out from the darkness behind them. "That's far enough, officer." Davis' breath caught in his throat as he turned to face the figure emerging from the shadows. It was Travis, his former partner, his expression cold and unreadable, a gun in his hand, aimed directly at Davis. "Travis, no," Davis whispered, barely able to process the sight of him, standing there like a stranger. "What are you doing?" Travis didn't flinch. He didn't even look surprised. "What do you think I'm doing, Davis? I'm making sure this ends. I tried to warn you, but you never listen." "Why?" Davis' voice cracked. "Why betray me? Why all this?" Travis' lips twisted into a faint smile, but it wasn't comforting. "It's never about betrayal, Davis. It's about survival. We're all just pawns in a much bigger game." The words stung like a slap, but Davis was too numb to argue. Travis' eyes shifted, and for a fleeting second, he looked almost sorry, almost. "You don't have to do this, Travis," Davis said, his voice shaking. "You can still walk away. We can fix this." But Travis' expression hardened. "No, Davis, it's too late for that. You're already too deep." Just as Travis began to raise his gun again, there was a sudden, deafening crash from the other side of the room. The door slammed open, and a new figure rushed in. This time, it was a woman, tall and imposing, dressed in a sharp suit. She was older, more experienced, with an air of authority that made Travis freeze. "You're done, Travis," the woman said coolly, her voice cutting through the tension like a knife. "Put the gun down." Travis hesitated, his eyes flicking between her and Davis. "What are you doing here?" he asked, his voice tight. The woman didn't answer immediately. She took a step forward, her gaze hard. "I'm ending this. Now." Before anyone could react, a flurry of movement erupted. The woman reached for her gun, and in a blur of motion, everything seemed to happen at once. Shots were fired, but it wasn't clear who had shot whom. The air was filled with the sound of pounding footsteps, but it wasn't just from the men in suits. The building was coming apart. People were running, shouting, and through the chaos, Davis could barely keep his bearings. He dove toward the ground, rolling to the side as a bullet whizzed past his head. Maya grabbed him by the arm, pulling him into cover behind an overturned desk. "This is it, Davis. We have to end this now." Davis' heart was racing, adrenaline surging through him as he tried to process everything that was happening. The woman was dead. Travis had betrayed him. The entire building was collapsing, both literally and figuratively. But there was something he couldn't shake. A nagging feeling in his gut that told him there was more to this than just a betrayal, more to this game than he had been led to believe. Then it hit him. The final twist. The woman in the suit, the one who had just arrived to save him, she wasn't just an ally. She wasn't part of the plan. She was in charge. She had been orchestrating everything from the very beginning, pulling strings, moving pieces around, making sure that every step Davis and Maya took was part of a larger design. Travis had been her pawn, just like he had been. And Davis? He had been playing right into her hands. "Get down!" Maya shouted, pulling him back to reality just as another round of gunfire erupted. The woman in the suit stepped forward, her gun aimed directly at Travis. "You failed," she said coldly. "Now you'll answer for it." As the chaos raged on, Davis' mind began to race. What had started as an attempt to help his partner had spiraled into something far darker, something that no one could control. And as the woman's cold eyes met his, the final piece clicked into place. The game wasn't over. It was only just beginning.